Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, Between Two Titans, the Draghi Plan on the Recovery of Europe's Economic Powerhouse Status. This event is part of the EP2 Campus program of the Former Members Association of the European Parliament, and we are honored to have such an engaged audience joining us both online and in person here at SNSPA. My name is Alexandru Bondoc, and I'm a volunteer at the Center for the Study of International Development and Migration at SNSPA's Faculty of Political Science. I am delighted to serve as today's moderator for what promises to be a thought-provoking and timely discussion. As we gather today, we find ourselves at a crucial moment for Europe's economic future. The global landscape is shifting rapidly, with growing competition between economic superpowers, namely the United States and China. In this complex environment, the European Union must define its path forward. How can it remain competitive? What strategies should it adopt to strengthen its economic position? And is the Draghi Plan the solution for European competitiveness? To help us navigate these critical questions, we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Leslie Huckfield, a distinguished former member of the European Parliament and a professor of economics at the Open University of Scotland. Dr. Huckfield has deep expertise in European economic policy and will be sharing his insights on the EU's competitiveness compass, the role of industrial policy, and Europe's response to global economic challenges. Following Dr. Huckfield's keynote presentation, we will have commentary from Dr. Claudiu Crăciun, head of the Political Sciences and European Studies Department here at our Faculty of Political Sciences, who will provide further analysis and reflection on this very important topic. Finally, we will open afterwards the floor for a Q&A session, giving you all an opportunity to engage directly with our distinguished speakers. I encourage you to participate actively, for this is a chance to discuss, debate, and to better understand the pressing economic decisions that will shape Europe's future. With that, let's roll, and please welcome Dr. Leslie Huckfield.
Right, okay. I want to say, first of all, that I'm very honoured to be asked to make this presentation this afternoon, and I'm very grateful to everybody who's made it possible, not only colleagues in the Former Members Association in Brussels, but also to Oana and Alina and others in Bucharest, because frankly, without their help, this would not have been possible. We're doing this presentation, as you probably understand, in 3 different time zones this afternoon. It's 2 o'clock in Scotland, where I am, it's 3 o'clock in Brussels, and of course it's 4 o'clock in Bucharest, so I do hope that all of this works out. Just a few personal comments to begin with, if I may. I was a member of the European Parliament in the days when the Berlin Wall still existed. In fact, I actually used my European Parliament laissez-passer to cross from East to West Berlin through Checkpoint Charlie to get across the Berlin Wall. So I go back that far as the previous histories, particularly of Central and European member states of the European Union exist. Since that time in the European Parliament, I spent a fair amount of time working on European funding. I spent a lot of time, for example, in the Baltics, in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and in Poland, particularly southeast Poland. After that, I've done a lot of work in England and in Scotland on European funding. Obviously, since Brexit, we no longer have the kind of access to European funding that we used to have. But I'm just saying all of this because I wouldn't like you to get the impression that my specialism in European funding or my specialism in European matters is a one-day wonder. It goes back a bit more than that, so I thought I should explain that kind of level of detail. Can I also say, by the way, that this is me expressing opinions based on what I've read and based on what I've gathered. I've always said to my students, and I teach at both the Open University, and thank you, by the way, for making me a professor for the day. I'll pretend to be a professor, although I'm actually a senior lecturer. I also supervise students at Glasgow Caledonian University, so I'm, first of all, an academic, but I'm still an active member of the Former Members Association. I should just say, by the way, that I'm always keen saying to my students, you have to show where you got your arguments from. You have to show your sources. So this isn't me expressing personal opinions. It's based on what I've gathered, and the last 3 slides in my PowerPoint presentation give all of my sources and where I've gathered the information from. And what I've done in those last 3 slides is not only to give my sources, but also to give some links so that hopefully you will be able to go straight to those sources yourselves. For those, by the way, who've seen an earlier version of my presentation, which I distributed with what I call a health warning, I have made some slight changes in the headings to slides and in 1 or 2 insertions as well. I haven't made any big changes, but I have made some changes to the headings which will hopefully make it a bit more understandable and a bit more readable. I should also explain, by the way, that my usual technique in delivering these presentations is not to speak or not to read through every slide. I will simply comment on what I regard as the highlights in each slide. But having said that, it's very important, if I may say this, that you have a look at the notes underneath each slide. I put some very detailed notes underneath each slide. So if you want to recap, or if you want to go back to things that I've been saying in the presentation, don't just have a look at the PowerPoint slides. Have a look at the notes under each slide, which go into a lot more things in a lot more detail. Having said that, let me get going and let me try and screen share, and hopefully this will work for you, as I hope it will also work for me. Let me go straight into the... First of all, by the way, I really do want to thank the EP to Campus programme for making all of this possible. This is a programme, obviously, which is headed up by Mick Hindley in the Former Members Association, and it's the Former Members Association EP to Campus programme which has made this presentation today possible. Okay, let me go to the overview. And the reason that I put before Friday the 28th of February is that Friday the 28th of February was that very important meeting in the Oval Office between Volodymyr Zelensky, J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, which has obviously changed things quite considerably since then. So this is a presentation which is essentially prepared before that meeting. But I think that many of the topics which I've put in the presentation really haven't changed that much underneath since. First of all, my main contention is that Draghi's competitiveness report, which he produced for the European Union in October 24, was actually a bit late in the day, because many others have been making forecasts about what needed to happen to economies in Europe about 5 years before that. I think the other main point that I want to try and say to underline all of this is that the global context in which we're working has obviously changed a lot. And I'm not quite sure that the European response to all of this has recognized the extent of that change which has taken place. And I'm not quite sure either whether the European Union Commission's response to the Draghi report, whether that's necessarily the best approach because of that changed global context. The other thing, by the way, that I don't believe that the competitiveness compass, and I shall keep referring, by the way, to the competitiveness compass, because that's the European Commission's response to Draghi. I still don't think that the competitiveness compass focuses enough on the advantages that Europe has still got, particularly in what we call clean technologies, and I'll explain that a bit later. But the other thing that concerns me is that the competitiveness compass is a very broad brush approach. And I'm really not quite sure that that enables the European Union and its member states to respond adequately to the situation that Europe now faces. Okay, let me continue a bit more and set the background. This is a couple of brief charts which I think illustrate the changed global context. This is GDP growth just in 2024, just last year. And you'll see that China, very much ahead of the US, certainly very much ahead of the EU. And it's the same if we look over the past 5 years. And again, the change in GDP or GDP growth over the past 5 years, again, you will see that China has leapt ahead very, very significantly indeed. And I'm afraid to say that I think a lot of people, particularly in Europe, are only just about catching up with the way in which all of that has happened. Let me give you some of the basic details, but before I do that, I want to headline some of the other points which I want to refer to throughout this presentation. First of all, now there is the complete domination in terms of industrial strategy of global trade by both the US and China, particularly following the US Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 and the growth of very, very direct and purposive productive production subsidies. The other thing is that the European Union didn't really start responding to that until it started imposing tariffs on the imports of Chinese vehicles in October 2024. So despite the fact that the Inflation Reduction Act and Chinese production subsidies had taken place considerably in time before that, the European Union only really started to respond in kind last October. And the response, as you know, was followed by Draghi in October 2024 and was followed by the European Commission's competitiveness compass in January 2025. And I'm not quite sure, as I will keep trying to say to you, that the broad brush approach of the competitiveness compass, and okay, it only appeared just a couple of months ago, is necessarily the right approach. Let's get down to some of the basic details. And don't forget that all the while that I'm saying this, under every slide that I'm giving to you, there were much more detailed notes, because all I'm giving you in each presentation slide are the headings of the much more detailed notes that I put in the notes underneath. First of all, whether we believe it or not, the EU has still the same share of global GDP as China. And the other advantage, of course, that the EU has got is that it's a single market, 440 million customers, 23 million companies. The other thing which we keep tending to neglect is that in terms of sustainability and environmental standards and progress to what we call the circular economy, the EU, not only in terms of a policy framework, but in terms of opportunities, has got a lot more advantages which are not frequently mentioned. The problem that we've got is that although the European Union's got some very valid and praiseworthy ambitions in terms of social inclusion, carbon neutrality, and geopolitical relevance, all of that depends on there being adequate growth in the European Union economies. And unfortunately, that's not taken place. The European Union's growth has been persistently slower than the US over the past 2 decades, and China is rapidly catching up in all of those areas. And the gap in GDP, if you have a look at 2015 prices, widened from slightly more than 15% in 2002 to a 30% gap in GDP in 2023. And if you have a look at that based on purchasing power parity, then a basic gap of 12% had appeared. So there are very, very significant disadvantages from which the European Union starts in terms of growth and GDP, and certainly, as I will explain later, in productivity. Okay, it's not just the fact that the European Union's overall situation is serious, it's the fact that unfortunately it's constantly declining. Now, I'm only going to refer to what I believe are the headline points from each of these slides. So again, if I may repeat myself, have a look at the notes underneath afterwards. First of all, if you have a look at the estimation of the European Central Bank, sectors where China directly competes with the euro area's exporters are now 40%. In other words, the European Central Bank's estimate, if you have a look at the sectors where China directly competes with the EU, that's 40% of those sectors, and that's up from 25% in 2002. And in addition to all of that, Europe's position, particularly in advanced technologies, and those are the advanced technologies which obviously are going to drive future growth, all of that is declining all of the time. The major problem, of course, that Europe has got is energy prices, because since the start of the Ukraine war, European companies face electricity prices 2 to 3 times higher than those in the US, and natural gas prices 4 to 5 times higher. So we've got a very serious situation in the difference between energy prices in the US and China and the EU. The difficulty that we've got in trying to remedy something about that is that the framework for doing something or bringing forward amendments or doing something directly about those policies, we don't have the same level of coordination possibilities in the EU as have previously and still currently, despite Trump operate in the US and obviously with very direct production subsidies operate in China. The lack of coordination is a feature which Draghi quite rightly refers to, and I'll be referring to that more later. Okay, China is obviously a very serious competitor. And we've got a situation where not only are Chinese exports outpacing global trade, but most of that growth in increasing exports from China is coming directly at the expense of Europe. So Chinese exports up 12% in volume terms. Global trade is growing at 3%. So you can see that Chinese expansion in exports is growing faster than the growth in global trade. And as I say, most of that growth in China's stronger exports is coming directly at the expense of Europe. If you have a look at the penetration details, particularly with electric vehicles, and these are the European Commission's figures, not mine, the European Commission found that the market share of Chinese electric vehicles rose from only 3.5% in 2020 to nearly 30% of all electric vehicles in the second quarter of 2024. So it's a very, very rapid growth and a very, very incursion from Chinese electric vehicle exports into the EU. And as I say, the EU didn't even start thinking about tariffs on that until October 2024. And we've now got a situation where Chinese brands have a share which has grown from 1.9% to 14.1% of all electric vehicles sold. So a very, very rapid growth, a very, very rapid penetration, but a penetration which has been particularly at the expense of what remains of European manufacturing sectors. Okay, this of course is particularly at the expense of Germany. Germany industrial production has been declining for the past 5 years, and that's a country obviously where manufacturing still contributes 5.5 million jobs and still composes 20% of GDP. And it's been very, very late in the day that Germany has started to realize that China's automotive, clean technology and aviation directly now, much more directly compete with their own manufacturing. So we've got a situation where not only is China exporting into global trade at the expense of Europe, but it's doing that at the expense particularly of German manufacturing sectors. So we have a situation where although China's previous exports were in sectors like consumer electronics, furniture, apparel, household appliances, China's main competition now is coming especially in sectors where the German economy was once the leader, and bearing in mind that China was not even a net exporter of vehicles in 2020, it now exports 5 million more vehicles than it imports. And if you compare the German figure is down 1.2 million, and it's down to half of what it was pre-COVID. So we have a situation where China's increased penetration, not only directly at the expense of the EU, but particularly at the expense of German manufacturing sectors. So the European Union decision to put tariffs on imported Chinese vehicles last October was certainly very late in the day. Now, and of course, this had the consequence that we've got now quite a serious deindustrialization in Germany. Volkswagen and other companies are starting to do layoffs. And the layoffs, as I say, are not because Germany is not competing. It's because of the fact that that competition is coming directly from China. And as I said before, previous Chinese penetration of the EU was in sectors where, like consumer electronics, furniture, apparel, etc., where you could argue that it wasn't quite as significant. But that competition now is in the automotive and the engineering sectors, which are at the heart of the German economy. So very serious situation for the EU, particularly a very serious situation for Germany. And okay, you can say that with a new German chancellor and with a new German government, they are going to probably try and bring in policies which will do something about that. But I have to keep saying to you, it's a bit late in the day. Because previously, up until last October, the European Union's response to that and Germany's response to that was to embark on what they called a de-risking policy. In other words, to make it just a bit more difficult for those Chinese vehicle exports to get into the EU and Germany. And Toda has already commented that the de-risking policy before the introduction of tariffs in October 2024 was frankly like taking a knife to a gunfight. That was how outdated, that was how inefficient, that was how impossible the previous European Union policies of de-risking were. So I have to say this to you, we've got a situation, I think, where German and European Union political thinking overall is only just starting to catch up with the realities of Chinese and global competition. Let's have a look at the US. Now, again, if you want a bit more insight into what I'm trying to say, there's been a fascinating discussion over the past couple of weeks, which has taken place between Jason Furman, who was President Obama's lead on the Council of Economic Advisors, and Gene Sperling, who took the lead in President Biden's America Rescue Act. Now, not all of that discussion is about the Inflation Reduction Act, but because I've put the links in the PowerPoint, you can have a look at Jason Furman's and Gene Sperling's contribution. But what I would suggest to you above all, have a look at the depth of those contributions and what's been happening to the American economy, both on the supply side and the demand side. Because quite honestly, I have not seen that done for Europe. And although it's the case that there is an extensive policy framework in Europe, I have not seen that level of analysis. So have a look at the two references that I put in the last three slides and have a look at the basis of that discussion, because the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 frankly meant massive subsidies into sectors that matter. It meant particularly massive subsidies into low-tech and clean tech sectors. And because the Inflation Reduction Act was administered through the tax code, it was very, very easy for companies to take advantage of considerable sums of money which were made available in that way. They didn't have to apply for the money. They didn't have to make application to the European Commission, or they didn't have to make application to Next Generation EU or whatever kind of funding it might be in Europe. They simply had to put in their tax code what they were investing in and what they were producing. And again, if you want to have a look at the way that that works, just Google Inflation Reduction Act and have a look at the way that those subsidies were administered. I've given the example at the bottom of this slide of the Italian solar panel factory 3Sun in Catania, Italy, which currently is scheduled to receive about 188 million euros in EU funds. But if 3Suns was located, say, in Southern California, during the Inflation Reduction Act's lifetime, it would get as much as $1.26 billion in production subsidies. So that's been the effect of the Inflation Reduction Act. But if you want to have a look at the amount of detail that the European Union ought to be studying, go back to that Jason Furman versus Gene Sperling discussion, which is not specifically and exclusively about the Inflation Reduction Act, but it does show the level of detail into which the European Commission and the European Union ought to be getting. Okay, so we're now in a world, and you can't get away from this, where countries having industrial strategies, particularly countries having industrial strategies for global trade, that's the new normal. And as I say, since the competitiveness compass, which is the European Commission's response to Draghi, didn't appear until January 2025, it really is coming a bit late in the day. There's also the issue that we have to take account of, that although we might do all we might like to do in terms of subsidies, in terms of direct legislation, directives, regulations, there are still some sectors where, quite honestly, it will be still very difficult for the European Union to catch up. And of course, one of the main problems that we've got underlying all of that is the fact that United States spending on research and development relative to GDP has continued to outpace and will continue to do that in terms of percentage of GDP. In 2010, the US spent 2.7% of GDP on research and development. The EU was only 2%. In 2021, the US was at 3.5% and the EU was at 2.3% of GDP. And China overtook the EU in the percentage of GDP spent on research and development in 2019, and that has continued to grow. I now want to be a bit more historical, and I'm sorry to jump from slide to slide, but I've got a lot to get through, and because I've got a lot to get through, please have a look at the notes under each slide, which explain things in much more detail. We need to take account of what we now call the two China shocks. There was a Chinese shock when China first started to increase significantly its share of global trade in the 1990s and the early 2000s. What happened then, of course, was that in the US particularly, there was massive deindustrialization in the Midwest. What happened in Europe was that a lot of manufacturing capacity in the older member states in the European Union was shifted to the newer European member states in Central and Eastern Europe. But the problem with the second China shock, which is the one that we face now, is that first of all, the EU has got far more manufacturing jobs than the US had at that time, 30 million compared with 17 million in 2000. The other problem that we've got is that China's manufacturing trade surplus as a share of global GDP is now twice as large. So again, I keep trying to say, and I'm not going to apologise for repeating myself, I think that Draghi's report and the competitiveness compass response are very belated responses to a world in which those kind of strategies are normal. I think for me, the very interesting thing is that the International Monetary Fund did a rather similar study to Draghi which was published in April 2024. In other words, it was published about 6 months before the Draghi report, but they came to quite different conclusions. In fact, they were conclusions which were a bit more aligned to the ones that I'm trying to present to you in this presentation, because what the IMF said is if you want to do something about the lack of competitiveness, it needs to take place at a much more localized and regional level. So it's not just me saying this, it's also the International Monetary Fund. Okay, again, I've tried to say at the beginning, we're not trying to focus on areas where Europe still has significant advantages. There has been a shift in the geopolitical environment. The European economic model and industrial policy are frankly, again, if you have a look at Linda, are on an unsustainable trajectory. And because the policies that we're pursuing at the moment, without some quite drastic changes, are unsustainable, then obviously Europe's competitive position is not going to be changing very much. If you have a look at the policy response which we've done so far in Europe, a lot of member states' responses obviously take place at a different level to those in the European Commission. But again, this comes back to the lack of central direction, the lack of central overlook. And if you compare that with the production subsidies in China, if you compare that with the efficacy of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, you will see that not only are their strategies a lot more centrally coordinated, but they are a lot more effectively delivered. Okay, let's just talk a bit more about clean tech, because clean tech is something that I want to keep emphasizing in this presentation. And let me just clarify, because again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, we're talking about some electric vehicles, batteries, heat pumps, solar, wind turbines, electrolyzers, and the production of low carbon fuel. Now, these are all areas where the European Union, provided that we bring in substantial policies and provided that we focus them properly, those are all areas in which the EU has still some advantages. If you have a look at the McKinsey report from 2023, for example, they projected that between 120 and 150 new battery factories would be needed by 2030 globally. And the European Union, particularly in the newer member states, has actually got quite a significant advantage in supplying a lot of that capacity. So the European Union's still got the production capacity, especially in some of the newer member states, and more than 1/5 of clean and sustainable technologies for the world as a whole were actually developed in Europe. So I'm not saying that we don't have advantages in anything. We have advantages, particularly in the policy framework that we've got in clean tech. Okay, let's have a look at some of the tools that we might be talking about if we want to implement some of these policies in more detail. And again, although this is covered in general terms in the competitiveness compass, it doesn't focus sufficiently enough. And if you have a look at the emission trading scheme, if you have a look at the carbon border adjustment mechanism, there are several bands that the European Union has got, both at central level and member state level. So we have a situation where a lot of the policy framework exists, and a lot of the production capacity obviously exists, but it needs bringing together. You can't get away, by the way, from the fact that in all of this, Europe still has a heck of an energy problem. I gave you the figures about the more expensive natural gas, the more expensive electricity, and that cost gap isn't going to go away. So even if we start to focus the policies that I want to describe in more detail, that cost gap in energy is still going to be there. And the problem that we've got is that continuing to try and subsidize that energy cost differential is hardly going to be sustainable, especially if Europe continues to depend on imported natural gas and particularly depending on imported fossil fuels. So we've got a problem where even if Europe tries to do something to subsidize and to bring down the size of that energy gap, that's not a very sustainable policy. We've also got a situation where company size matters. No company in the European Union with a market capitalization of more than 100 billion euros has been set up from scratch in the past 50 years. During that time, 6 US companies with a valuation of more than 1 trillion euros have been created during that same period. The other problem, of course, that we've got is that any real growth that we might have usually comes in what we call mature technologies, where frankly the breakthrough potential for other sectors and the breakthrough potential for affecting other sectors of the economy is much more limited. And Europe's top 3 investors in research and innovation are actually still dominated by car companies, auto companies, and have been for the past 20 years. It was the same in the US previously, but of course, obviously now that the US is moving much more into new tech and AI, that focus has completely changed. But the difference in support is also important. There is much more China direct support for industry, so that direct support for industry in China was actually at 1.73% of GDP in 2019. And the figure that I've highlighted there is that large industrial companies in China may receive almost 9 times more government support relative to company size than comparable companies in the OECD area. So if you just have a look at the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and have a look at the effects of production subsidies in China, you will see that they are much more direct, they are much more effective. Okay, one of the problems that we've got, of course, arising from all of this is that unfortunately, as it stands at the moment, the European Union's coordination machinery, and this is coming from Draghi particularly, and this is a point that Draghi keeps making, Europe doesn't coordinate where it matters. And whereas industrial strategies in the US and China, and that's a combination of multiple policies, whether it's fiscal policies, whether it's domestic production encouragement, or whether it's trade policies, there's a whole range of policies which are much more effectively coordinated in China and much more effectively coordinated in the US. That's not the case in the EU. And Draghi makes the point that the way in which we introduce legislation in the EU, particularly if it comes from the Commission has to introduce it, there's a large period of consultation, goes to the European Parliament before approval, then has to be disseminated, approved by member states, Draghi estimates that that period, the length of time that all of that takes, is something like 19 months. So from an initial policy decision to actual implementation on the ground, we might actually be talking almost 2 years. So that even if the European Union in clean tech, for example, was to start devising many more detailed policies and encouragement of clean tech, anything to work out on the ground will probably take at least 2 years. The other problem, of course, that we've got is raising private capital to do that. Because although individual member states in the European Union have got their own capital markets, we don't have an integrated European Union capital market. We've got a Euro group of finance ministers, but they don't represent an integrated structure. The ECB does, but in terms of raising private money, we need an integrated capital markets union. So have a look at what's underlying all of this. It's not just the fact that we've got a lack of coordination. It's not just the fact that we've got a much smaller capital market setup. It's also the fact that we've got a very low growth in productivity. If you have a look at European private business expenditure on research and development, it grew from 1.36% of GDP in 2000 it grew from, let me just go back to the appropriate slide. If you have a look at the growth in financial investment, and let me go back, I'm sorry, to the appropriate slide. So the interesting gap that still remains to be filled is not only a distinctly slow growth of productivity, it's the fact that the potential for productivity increases isn't there. And the main driver of diverging developments has been the slow productivity growth in the European Union. So 70% of the gap between GDP in the US at purchasing power parity, 70% of that gap is explained by low productivity and low productivity growth. So it's a very difficult situation, in that we've got low investment in the places that it matters. And unfortunately, as I say, if you have a look at the sectors in which the research and development expenditure is, you will see that 70% of the gap in per capita GDP with the US is because of lower productivity in the EU. I've already mentioned the energy subsidies. We can't do much about that. But what we are able to do a lot more about is that competitiveness involves a number of factors, not just because of sectoral or industrial competitiveness, but in terms of skills, in terms of lack of asymmetries, and in terms of what the European Union, frankly, can do something about. Okay, let's just go back to what I was saying previously about clean tech. It isn't just the fact that we've got a policy framework and we're not using that in detail. It isn't just the fact that we can't raise the private capital because we haven't got an integrated capital markets union. It's the fact that even if we tried to implement Draghi, the cost of implementing Draghi, quite honestly, is formidable. We're actually talking about between 750 to 800 billion pounds to implement Draghi. So that's a very, very big cost. And to implement all of that, obviously, that would be pretty big. It will certainly dwarf the capacity of next generation EU. It would be the same size that the European Union is now talking about in terms of defence capability. The other problem, of course, that we've got is that if you have a look at the way in which the European Union delivers its programmes, it's scattered across a very wide range of programmes, and that obviously makes it much more difficult. So the focus isn't there, the expenditure isn't there, and if we have a look at the cost of Draghi, 750 to 800 billion, and that would be something like 4.4 to 4.7% of EU GDP in 2023. So I've made the comparison, as has Draghi, with the investment that was done under the Marshall Plan between 1948 and 51, and that was equivalent to 1 to 2% of EU GDP. And you can see that delivering Draghi would be a much higher percentage of EU GDP than that. So to implement Draghi seriously, we've got to talk about having the capacity to raise private money, also to public money. Okay, it is of course possible. It is of course possible for the European Union to do some borrowing. We've got the fact that the Next Generation EU programme, we have to start repaying the capital on some of that in 2028. We've got the fact that we've got a very slow growing and not very effective capital markets union across the European Union. We've also got the fact that decision making in the EU is very complicated. Now, the other criticism and the other difficulty that I have, particularly with the competitiveness compass, if you read through the way that the Commission seeks to implement the policies that it wants to implement, not only are they across the European Union as a whole, but they're going to be implemented through what we call the European semester process. And the problem with the European semester process, for those of you who know a bit more about European funding, is that the European semester process means that from time to time, the European Commission makes specific recommendations for each member state and circulates those recommendations on a basis of country-specific recommendations to member states. But to be quite honest with you, not only are those recommendations in many cases not very specific, but countries don't respond to them very well. And if you have a look at quite a few of the learned articles which have been done on the European semester process, and particularly the articles by Darbus and Leandro, they come to the conclusion that any kind of attempt to coordinate structural policy throughout the European semester process has been largely unsuccessful. And the reason for that, quite honestly, is that in many cases, the recommendations for individual countries are not very specific, but the response rate from individual countries is even less successful. So the main process then that the competitiveness compass is going to use to deliver its response to Draghi is going to be using a process that quite honestly doesn't work very well. Now, I'm going to start to come to my conclusion now, because there is another focus, there is another policy series of parameters that we ought to be having a look at. And I take as my main academic base here an article which was done by Christian Kettels and Michael Porter in 2020. Michael Porter, that's Michael Porter of Harvard Business School fame. Christian Kettels was actually an advisor to the previous Commission Vice President Dombrovskis. So, I mean, these are people who, if I may say so, have got skin in the game, they know what they're talking about. But this particular academic article, and I hope that you'll have a look at it, what it is really saying is that much more it ought to be European countries and regions that ought to be taking responsibility for economic policy and outcomes locally and nationally. And the sovereignty to make choices ought to be done at the country and regional level, and a willingness to accept that there's going to be heterogeneous outcomes across Europe as a whole. Now, that certainly isn't the focus. That certainly isn't the focus of the competitiveness compass. Again, what I'm trying to say then, and I'm coming to my conclusion, so thank you very much for being patient. The Draghi report and the European Commission's competitiveness compass are frankly a bit late in the day, particularly compared with the very big figures for Chinese direct production subsidies, and particularly in response to the very big figures of tax set-offs which are available under the American Inflation Reduction Act. It really is coming to the game, it really is coming to a field lately where industrial policies for global trade have become a necessity. As I've said, faced with the kind of funding difficulties and implementation difficulties, I think Kettels and Porter's view that the emphasis on strategic decisions and action priorities need to make at regional level and country level much more relevant. That goes back, by the way, to that IMF report that I referred to in April 2024, which is basically saying the same thing, that much more of the focus for a competitiveness response in Europe needs to be at the local and regional level. To end with two quotes again from Kettels and Porter, there is an inability nowadays, I think, with top-down centralized EU policy level approaches to deal with the fundamentally different competitiveness challenges faced by Europe, and European countries and regions must take more responsibility for economic policy choices and outcomes locally and nationally. That's the main point that I want to make. And again, just to rehearse what I'm saying, And I'm sorry that I've had to go through a heck of a lot, but please have a look at the notes and you'll pick up much more of the detail of what I'm trying to say. First of all, Draghi is late in the day. The competitiveness compass with its very broad brush approach, I've got my doubts, frankly, whether that is the right approach. That's particularly in a context where the European Union still has certain EU clean tech advantages, not only with production capacity, but also with the policy framework. We've got a far better policy framework for doing clean tech than exists in the US and that which exists in China. So we've still got the possibilities with the policy framework and with production capacity, provided that we focus what we're trying to do, as I say, much more at a local and a national level. That's the main point that I'm trying to make. Just my final 3 slides, and again, I've been very grateful for your patience and hanging on until now. I've put 3 pages of what I usually call to my students my bibliography. And that shows you where I got all of the stuff that I've been saying. What I've tried to do, by the way, is instead of your having to go to a library link or a university link, which makes things a bit difficult, I've tried to put a direct internet link to all of the sources that I've used. Most of those sources, by the way, ought to be viable, ought to be accessible, provided that you use them in the format that I'm using today. So finally, thank you very much indeed for listening. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry I've had to proceed at a very rapid rate. Please have a look at the notes underneath. And thank you again to the ePeter Campus programme and to all of those in Brussels and Bucharest who've made this possible. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. It was surely very insightful to everybody present and listening to us online. And I believe you did a very good job at presenting the points in a very structural and aired out manner. So the information delivery was top notch, so to speak, Professor.
I wish my students would say that.
Now I'd like to invite Dr. Claudiu Crăciun to give us his insights on the Draghi report and what we have listened to, if he may.
Thank you very much. And yes, I'm not sure you heard the claps earlier, but I can assure you that there were. So your presentation was very well received, and thank you for that. I was frankly expecting a more critical tone, because I think that the whole process and the final report of the Draghi Commission, I think it invites criticism. And I would just mention a few things along the way, maybe some blind spots and also some lack of direction or lack of strategy. And from the very beginning, I think it's very clear that this Draghi report, even though it has a diagnosis that we can share and we can understand, that the EU is losing, it's kind of sleepwalking into irrelevance at the global stage, with China and the US changing the rules of the game along the way. Basically, the first point is that it lacks a clear direction, and it kind of changes an accent from competitiveness understood from a business sector perspective, for example, targeting regulatory burdens, which is very much in the kind of the neoliberal way of thinking about competitiveness, and then later on kind of deploring the lack of industrial policy, like real industrial policy, which he also defines as, giving an example of US and China, for example, combining multiple policies ranging from fiscal policies to encourage domestic production, to trade policies to penalize anti-competitive behavior, and to foreign economic policies to secure supply chains. So there are hints of real industrial policy as like the correct and the good way to face up the competition of the US and China. But that option is not really followed to its more, let's say, ultimate and decisive conclusions. So this would be, frankly, I'm not sure what is the reason for this kind of intellectual, political, and economic barrier. Why aren't we able to actually have industrial policy at the EU level and the national level, seeing that US recently is bringing a lot of subsidies to the production, and of course China has done that for quite a while. And in your presentation, I saw those figures. I didn't know them, but they're quite telling. The amount of money that China puts into direct industrial support as a share of GDP. And it's currently standing at 1.76, if I'm not mistaken, whereas Germany and France, they're somewhere 0.4, 0.5. Why couldn't you write in this kind of report that an objective, like an aim of this strategic plan would be to increase the support for industry? And I also have an answer. I think the way the common market was created, for example, limiting state aid as being a possible risk for the common market, kind of placed against this kind of strategy of the EU. So that made me think whether we have the basis for a real change in the EU, having protected the common market with these instruments, or investing a lot in the European semester, which looks as it is centering the whole economic process around very questionable objectives. For example, that can happen in an economy, and it's not. And the latest developments shows us that there is a way out of this thinking of devising political decisions as straitjackets rather than kind of stimulating actions. So yes, I would say that this is the most important critique, and I do agree that it's maybe too little too late. But I'm pretty sure that we're not even looking at the right direction with this plan. And also, I would say that it doesn't really dispel the myth of free trade and free markets, because we're living in a very different world right now. And we look at China, we look at the US, and they see they're changing the rules of the game. And the EU countries, they look like they are the last Samaritans defending free trade worldwide. I'm not sure where we have to be in that situation. And the last critique that I have, and I'm expecting to be a bit sympathetic with this critique, is that the issue of work and workers and their rights, including key institutions like collective bargaining, they're out of this plan. And if we are to think about the EU and its economy, is this even social model that is not just about welfare state. It's about how you organize the economy and how you bring communities and workers into the decision-making process. And I would say that the Draghi report is somehow blind to this very important dimension of economic progress. I'm not saying growth, because this is sometimes hijacked, but economic progress. So yes, that would be my commentary, and thank you very much for your presentation. Very structured, indeed something that is very helpful, not only for students but also for faculty as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I just ask, by the way, how you would like to conduct this? Because obviously, to give as many people as possible a chance to make a comment, I'm not going to intervene on every speaker. So just tell me how you would like to handle it. Would you like to take 3 contributions, say, and then get a response, or how would you like to handle it?
I also have a question to ask, or perhaps 2, so we could go with my question now.
Okay.
It's regarding China's economic growth. So we know that to reduce that second wave of the pandemic, the PCC really cracked down on people in China and followed zero COVID policy. How is it possible that after hurting their economy during those days and in that pretty brutal manner, they bounce back and have received this huge economic growth of 5% in 2024? Thank you.
Are there any more questions at this stage?
I have a question.
Yes.
Please.
Sorry, my name is Roxana. I'm a first year PhD student here at SNSPA. And my question is related with the involvement of China in EU's higher education. Because in Hungary, for example, the CEU University was forced to close its headquarters in Budapest as a rejection, basically, of the Western model of higher education to a point. But they also have agreement with China, where a Chinese university from Shanghai will open like a foreign headquarters inside Budapest, and it will promote basically some of the way China does higher education. If it's a successful model, it might spread even further. What do you think about this involvement of China in higher education in EU?
Shall I deal with that question first, because it's obviously a bit topical? I was in Budapest last October, so I mean, I very much understand some of the arguments which have emerged about Chinese involvement. Let me make a very broad comment, and I'm trying to be as non-political as I possibly can. We live in a changing world. We live in a changing world, and China's Belt and Road Initiative is manifesting itself in many places, including in Europe. And if that's meaning constructing railway lines which affect Hungary, if that means constructing and funding courses in universities, I think quite honestly, and obviously we need to have some safeguards, but quite honestly, I think we have to get used to that. Other countries have been subject to Chinese involvement, shall we say, for a much longer period. So I think we're going to have to get used to a lot more of that in Europe. The other thing you have to get used to is the fact that European money nowadays, under Article 2 and Article 7 of the treaty, comes with strings attached. So that if you take European money, and if you're in Hungary and other countries, you can either get that money reduced if they don't like your policies. So there is an incentive for some of the newer Central and Eastern European member states to try and find other sources of funding, and you've just referred to that in universities in Hungary. So I think we have to recognise that there is a changing world in terms of multipolar involvement. Let me go back to the main criticism. And the main criticism, and I'm very grateful for your very detailed response. To be candid with you, I think that the European Union's competitiveness compass in its response to Draghi is a typical European Commission response. It's a very broad brush approach. It's going to set up all kinds of agencies. It's going to mean all sorts of new developments. And quite honestly, even to implement some of the new features and agencies which have been outlined in the competitiveness compass, let alone getting to the main problems which have been highlighted by Draghi, simply to implement and set up some of the new agencies which have been referred to in the competitiveness compass, even doing that will take the rest of this Commission's period of 5 years. So I'm very concerned that this is a typical European Commission response to a problem which means a lot more focus. Now, the other thing which I'll say is that it isn't only the fact that it's a very broad brush response, it's the fact that it's going to rely on implementation and delivery for European processes which have been proven not to work very well. For those of us who've been involved in European funding over the years, we know that the semester process is not very effective. We know that the multi-annual financial plan process is not very effective. If you continue to rely on European Union existing procedures, and that's what the European semester process is, none of this is going to be very effective. The third point that I would like to make in response to the first contribution is that I really don't think that the competitiveness compass response has shown thus far that the European Union has really demonstrated its capability to respond to the focused approaches which we've had in the US and the approach and the focus which we've had in China. Because in China, as you quite rightly say, there was a lockdown process in COVID which was very strict. The recovery process was also very strict in that only certain sectors were encouraged to expand, And we've still got a lot of social and welfare catch up to do in China, which is one of the reasons, of course, that China has got an export surplus, because there isn't adequate scope on the demand side for taking up some of China's internal production, because the consumer side, the social side, and the welfare side wasn't expanded very rapidly after COVID in China. So we're not only talking about a very typical European Commission response, we're talking about the fact that the competition responses, particularly from the US and China, have been very, very focused indeed. I still don't think, by the way, that a lot of people in the European Union understand the way the Inflation Reduction Act works. If you simply say, all you've got to do, tell us what you're doing in terms of investment, tell us what you're doing in terms of production, provided that it matches the list of things for which you can get tax reductions, go ahead and set it against your tax code. In fact, when the Trump administration has taken steps to wind down some of the implications of the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of senators, even from Republican states, were saying, don't do that, because if you take away the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act, we can no longer see the investment which is taking place in our states. So a very focused approach in China, a very focused approach in the US, and I don't think the EU has yet caught up with that.
Right, thank you for your lengthy response. And now, how do we explain China's 5% economic growth in 2024?
Because only certain sectors were allowed to expand. I mean, we're talking about a very controlled economy, as you know. Only certain sectors were allowed to expand, and the banks and local authorities only in those sectors, they were the only ones that were allowed to expand. Now, when you've got that kind of centralized control over the economy, when you've got the capacity to put in large subsidies, that explains the level of economic growth. But it's an economic growth which has been based on having an export surplus and exporting particularly into countries which are vulnerable, and particularly it's Germany and the EU which have been on the receiving end of that massive expansion in trade.
Then I'll ask a final question, after which we can wrap up this webinar. I'm curious, how do we balance the new investment of 800 billion euro in defense with the necessity of implementing the Draghi plan overall?
Well, let me say that the EU has still a borrowing capacity, which it's tried to use previously under the Next Generation EU fund. I suppose, quite honestly, if the European Union is now going to prioritise borrowing for defence purposes, okay, I mean, it may be able to respond to what it perceives to be its defence needs. But my worry is that simply by expanding defence capabilities, you don't do anything to solve the underlying lack of competitiveness problems which are still going to exist. Now, okay, I mean, as a result of expanding European defence capabilities, and if we're talking about Thales, if we're talking about Rheinmetall, if we're talking about British Aerospace and defence companies, yes, indeed, we may be able to expand their capabilities. But the difficulty is that at the same time that they will be expanding, we're going to get continuing layoffs in Volkswagen, ThyssenKrupp, Siemens, and traditional German manufacturing companies and other companies like that. So yes, we will be able to expand defence capabilities, and we will be able to expand defence companies' production and their production capacity, but that may well come at the expense of layoffs and closures and deindustrialization elsewhere. So in terms of borrowing, I think the EU has still got the potential to borrow on an EU-wide scale, because don't forget that the way that Next Generation EU funds operate and the way that other European Union funds borrowing capacity operates, the repayments at the end of the day come from the individual member states. So the mechanism is there to increase EU borrowing. It's the priorities that worry me. It's the priorities that worry me. I'm not going to go into the politics of increased defence spending, but what I'm saying is that yes, you can increase defence spending in the EU and in individual member states, and yes, you can increase defence capacity in individual member states and in the EU, but a lot of that may still come at the expense of lack of competitiveness elsewhere. So yes, we can probably do more defence, but it may mean deindustrialisation elsewhere. It's also going to have repercussions in the social and welfare side, but I'm not going to get too much into the politics of that. But increasing defence expenditure means that you've still got a lot of the problems underlying everything that I've been trying to say today, and it may also, unfortunately, have to come at the expense of social and welfare spending, and that I find particularly worrying.
So do I.
Hello, sir. I'd like to address you two questions, if I may.
Please.
So, do you foresee a future where the EU, instead of competing with China and US, can establish stronger economic alliances with global players like India or ASEAN countries to create a counterbalance? And the second question is, given your experience in European policymaking, what is the one thing that policymakers constantly fail to understand and about Europe's economic challenges in the global context? Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Let me answer the second question first. The European Union, obviously, based on completing the single market, and if you have a look at Enrico Letta's report last April about completing the single market, that is still been the main focus of the European Union, particularly the European Commission. It's been based on convergence, using the cohesion fund, using the structural funds, completing the single market, convergence and cohesion. That's been one of the main focuses of the European Commission. And it's unfortunately, because we've still got that kind of focus in place, I don't think that the Commission itself has been capable so far of producing the kind of much more focused approach which might be necessary. For example, if you have a look at the cohesion fund, and when we're talking about cohesion fund, don't forget we're talking in many cases about an 85% grant rate. We're not just talking about the European Commission meeting half of the cost of a project. We're talking about the European Commission implementing or making a grant of 85% of the total cost of a project. So there is still that kind of capacity in the cohesion fund if they were adjusted to focus much more on clean tech industries and if they were adjusted to focus much more on particular industries. To get back to the first part of your question, I still think it's possible, provided that the European Union recognises the advantages that it has, and provided the European Union recognises even the policy framework advantages that it has. Because in terms of cross-border transmission, in terms of emission trading schemes, in terms of directives and regulations, I still think that the European Union has got much more of a policy framework potential than either China or the US if they chose to use it to focus on clean tech. So a lot of the production capacity is still there. Don't forget that, as I was saying in the presentation, a lot of the clean tech pioneering work worldwide has actually come from Germany, has actually come from the EU. So we've got the production potential, we've got the policy framework potential, but we need to be able to pull that together in the Commission particularly and make that much more focused. I have to say that in producing the competitiveness compass broad brush approach, I think that that was a typical European Commission response. Broad brush, set up a few more agencies, use existing processes, and quite honestly, using existing processes that have been proven not to work very well.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Right, thank you, Andrei. Now it's the last call for our listeners at home. If you have any more questions, I invite you to ask them. All right then, Dr. Huckfield, thank you very much for attending today. It was a very insightful webinar, and thank you all for coming to watch us have this important debate.
Well, thank you also to the Former Members Association, the EP to Campus programme, to Anna and Alina and everybody in both Brussels and Bucharest, which has made this possible. Thank you for having me and thank you for being very patient.
Thank you very much.